status quo objections are still a big part of objections, 44%. Well, that's less than half. 56% comes down to indecision. So talk to us about that.
We were looking at how salespeople deal with these moments of hesitation that customers express, right? In those moments, it's a really kind of a fork in the road for salespeople because they feel the deal slipping away from them. One of the big reasons that customers get cold feet is you haven't fully put the status quo to bed. So what we tell salespeople to do is one of three things. First thing they'll do is they'll go back and they'll try to re-articulate the benefits of the solution. The second play is usually FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Now, if those two things don't work, the third play we found was always the 10% discount that's only good this quarter.
The deal has been going well. You addressed all the pain points, prepared for every objection, even gotten on procurement's good side. Your committed deal feels solid. And then the deal isn't coming in. You're told it's not a priority anymore, that it's going to have to wait for at least 6 more months. What's worse, the buyer hasn't done anything. Status quo has won again. Why does this keep happening? On this episode of the Run Revenue Show, Matt Dixon breaks down the most powerful form of fear that is killing your deals and what you can do to beat it. Matt is the author of the must-read sales book, The Challenger Sale, and a founding partner of DCM Insights, a company helping organizations understand the constantly changing world of customer behavior. His latest book, The JOLT Effect, is all about the role indecision has in your customer's buying process and what you can do about it now. Here's Kyle.
I'm Kyle Coleman, sales pro turned SVP of marketing at Clary. Run Revenue is the show where revenue pros learn to stop revenue leak, achieve revenue precision, and grow their companies and careers.
This is Run Revenue Show with Kyle Coleman.
I am super excited to be joined today by Matt Dixon, multi-time author and most recent author of The JOLT Effect. Matt Dixon, how you doing?
Kyle, it's great to see you. Thank you for having me, and thank you for the kind words about the book.
Of course. This is not the first of your books that I have read and loved. You hooked me with the Challenger sale. You got me again with the Challenger customer, and here you are with the JOLT Effect a few years later. So talk us through a little bit of your background.
It's a good question. I was pondering this recently. Somebody said this on a podcast I was doing just a week or two ago, that they think of me as like a sales and customer experience anthropologist. And so what I do is I try to bring data and science and research methods to bear to try to understand how to tackle different sales problems that we're encountering out in the market. And I've always found the most interesting place to start is with what's changing in the customer buying environment. Because I think for as much as sales has changed, I actually think customer buying has changed even more. We talk about this in the book, in the JOLT Effect, that there's this idea of what we call the lead steer effect. And it's not to liken salespeople to cattle. However, if you think about a herd, what you'll typically find is that it's the leaders in the pack who are the ones out there changing direction based on what they see, right? There's an obstacle, there's an opportunity, and they change direction and the rest of the herd follows. And I think in sales, it's very similar. As we spot changes in customer buying behavior, what you see is that star salespeople will adapt their sales approach without ever reading a book about it, being trained to do it, being coached to do it. They just figure it out. And then that becomes a playbook that the rest of us can follow. And so we've kind of made our mark in the market, bringing data and science to bear to try to document those playbooks, whether that's Challenger, whether that's Challenger customer, finding and leveraging your mobilizer, or whether that's the problem of overcoming no decision losses, which is the topic of the new book.
Perfect. And the topic for today's show, the enemy of indecision. That's the main topic that we're going to explore today. And before we jump into that, Matt, give us a little bit more of the methodology that you pursued as you were finding all these different commonalities among top performers.
Yeah, great question. And actually, I think that's an interesting part of the story. If you rewind the clock, you mentioned Challenger earlier. Well, actually, if I rewind the clock even farther back, and we think about like Neil Rackham's study in spin selling, which I think many would recognize as the first large-scale study of sales effectiveness, Neil and his team traveled the world as psychologists and anthropologists. They sat in on 30,000 sales calls. Yeah, that was back in the late 70s, early 80s. If you fast forward to 2011, when we published the Challenger sale, we collected data from like 5,000 business customers. We collected data and used a survey-based methodology to study 6,000 salespeople in business to business across different industries. Today, we've got data on a few 100,000 as we continue to collect data around the Challenger study. that was our initial data set, 5,000 business customers, 6,000 salespeople who were analyzed using the survey. I mean, Neil Rackham's study took him like 10 years, and it probably cost several $1,000,000 in today's dollars to run that study, a team of about a dozen people. Challenger sale, we had a pretty big team as well. It took us like 2 to 3 years to fully unpack all of that data, to really understand the story and to write the book. Today, with the JOLT effect, it's actually like the Moore's law of sales research. We're able to use modern technology. We're actually the beneficiaries of this time, I think many of us remember, with pretty mixed emotions, which was March of 2020 when the world went into COVID lockdown. And in sales, as every CRO and sales person out there knows very well, this is a time when sales changed fundamentally. And we may never go completely back to where we were before, but sales went 100% virtual overnight. And so what that meant was we could capture calls, recorded sales calls, and use modern technology, machine learning and AI, to study them at scale. So we collected from several dozen companies about 2.5 million sales calls starting in spring of 2020 to probably fall of 2021. We used a machine learning platform from a company called Tether to study that. We built a predictive model of about 8,300 variables, all designed to understand what is it that the best salespeople are doing to avoid no decision losses, and also to understand what's going on that drives this behavior with our customers, because I think understanding it actually turns out is more than half the battle, as we'll discuss.
Super interesting. So 2.5 million different sales calls.
Yeah.
8,300 meaningful data points to investigate. And you built this predictive model that, if I remember correctly, it had about an 85% success rate to predict future outcomes based on the inputs that you saw. So all of this is to say, you can trust the data. You've hinted at it already. And again, the topic of the show today is the enemy of indecision. Yeah. Let me frame this up for you a little bit here, Matt, because what you taught me is that the status quo is the enemy. And this is a main pillar of the Challenger sales, that they are the best at overcoming the status quo, of reframing the problem, reframing the status quo. And now what the new research is showing is that, yes, status quo objections are still a big part of objections, 44%.
Sure.
Well, that's less than half. 56% comes down to indecision. So talk to us about that.
Yeah, that was pretty interesting to us. We were looking at how salespeople deal with these moments of hesitation that customers express, right? And you think about the sale in a 3-step journey, from engaging the customer in their status quo, the way they do things today, getting them to agree on your vision, a new way forward, and then buying your solution, right? That's the third act in the play. And what we found in the data is that there's this moment between where the customer says they want it, but before the point where they actually buy it, where they tend to start waffling and wavering and backpedaling and wringing their hands and saying, are we really sure we want to do this? This comes across in sales conversations as them bringing up objections that you thought you'd long ago addressed and put to bed, expressing concerns and confusion and skepticism and these kinds of things. And in those moments, it's a really kind of a fork in the road for salespeople, because they feel the deal slipping away from them. I had the happy years, and now I'm feeling not so great, because the things you're saying suggest to me that maybe you're not ready to buy. I had forecasted this thing for, next week or next month. And now, based on what you're saying, I think we're kind of all the way back at square one, and you might even disappear entirely. So we were looking at what salespeople tend to do. Now, as you remember, and you pointed out rightly, Kyle, in the Challenger sale, we talk about how one of the big reasons that customers get cold feet is that you haven't broken the gravitational pull of the status quo. That status quo bias is very powerful for our customers. And what we've told salespeople for a very long time is, if the customer say they want it, but then their hand kind of wavers a bit over the contract and they can't quite put pen to paper, the reason that's happening is you haven't fully put the status quo to bed. You haven't done away with it, right? They're still in the vice grip of the status quo. So what we tell salespeople to do is one of 3 things. So first thing they'll do is they'll go back and they'll try to re-articulate the benefits of the solution. So you must have missed how awesome your business is going to perform, how great life is going to be if you would just say yes. Like, how could you pass up on the amazing goodness that is our solution? The second play is usually FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. So we throw aside the positive and we go to the negative. We try to kind of create that burning platform, make the customer squirm a bit about the cost of inaction. Their competitors are gapping them in the market, and money is leaking out the door, and their employees hate them, and their customers hate them, and their shareholders, everybody hates them, and they have to fix this terrible state of affairs. Now, if those 2 things don't work, the third play we found was the 10% discount that's only good this quarter. And, those are all we found over time, pretty effective techniques to overcome that status quo. What we found, and this was pretty surprising actually, is that this happens all the time. So salespeople are doing exactly what they've been told to do. But we didn't expect to find is that set of plays, which I would characterize as kind of FOMO plays, right? It's all about missing out. You're missing out on the benefits. You're missing out on an opportunity to change your terrible status quo or fix it, or you're missing out on this discount, which is only available right now. Those FOMO plays, it turns out, it's not just that they are not effective. They're actually counterproductive. They actually increase the odds that you'll be lost to no decision. This was completely unexpected to us. And again, our first reaction was, holy smokes, like everything, we're going to have to saddle up for a global apology tour because everything we said in Challenger is wrong. So we got into it after we had that kind of deer in the headlights moment. The second thing we tried to do is make the finding go away. And we said, well, this must be a sample size problem. So we loaded more calls in the model. It actually got worse. The number wasn't as bad as it was. The math was correct. Our data science team assured us. And so we decided to kind of dig in the data and figure out what was really going on. And what we found was there are actually two reasons a deal can be lost to no decision. The first reason is because the customer prefers their status quo. They believe what they're doing today is good enough. They don't believe your solution is a compelling enough alternative to what they do today or a compelling enough reason to change, or they don't think it's a top priority to fix this or get after this in their business. But it turns out if you add those up, it's only 44% of no decision losses. 56% of the time, it has nothing to do with the customer's preference for the status quo, but has everything to do with their indecision, which itself stems from their fear of failure. Now, what I find is that when you say that to salespeople, the customers that Clary salespeople sell to, right? CFOs, CROs, like these are rational business people, right? They think in dollars and cents. They use spreadsheets, like they're numbers oriented. And so it can often be confusing to salespeople that their customers fear failure, especially senior executives. Like, isn't that what we pay them not to fear, is to make those tough calls and make those big bets and those big decisions for the organization? We figured, this is not something you just throw out there and say, oh, turns out there's this problem too. There's got to be some psychological explanation for it. And so we read about 30 years of social science journal articles, behavioral economics, cognitive psychology, so on and so forth. The most interesting thing we found was this. We're all familiar in sales with the status quo bias. We are optimized as human beings to not change because changing is hard. And that is a very powerful enemy to contend with in sales. But it turns out there's something else called the omission bias, which salespeople really need to understand. What the omission bias holds is that people are okay with doing nothing and having that result in a bad outcome for them. They're not okay with doing something and having that result in a bad outcome. So even if the bad outcome was exactly the same, people will always choose that loss that is a function of them doing nothing versus doing something. This is a little bit, I would say, macabre for this podcast maybe, but the example that's often used to illustrate this is, imagine, Kyle, there's a train heading down the tracks. You've just learned it's about to plow into a crowd of people and kill 5 people.
Yeah, the trolley problem.
And there's a lever right there. And if you pull that lever, you will save those 5 people. However, you will send the trolley in a different direction and it will kill 2 people. And psychologists have found, and it doesn't really make any rational sense, but people choose not to pull the lever because they don't want to be personally responsible for killing those 2 people. They would rather sit on the sidelines and watch the 5 people die because they had nothing to do with that so-and-so. That is, again, a function of the omission bias. And what that tells salespeople is that why these FOMO plays tend to backfire is that your customer cares a lot less about missing out than they do the FOMO than they do the FOMO. The FOMO is the fear of messing up.
Super interesting, Matt. I had no concept of this when I was a seller. I didn't understand how hard it is, not just to buy software, but to implement it, to get the change management done, to realize the value, to actually deliver on all the things that you say it's going to deliver on. And as soon as I put on my buyer hat, I was like, sheesh, I'd rather not do anything because it's working. And it reminds me of the old maxim that we are all used to hearing, which is that nobody got fired for buying IBM.
Yep. We actually found, there were 3 specific things that people tend to worry about messing up. First thing is choosing the wrong thing. This is especially prevalent in technology-based industries where our salespeople love just being bobbleheads with the customer. Yes, we could do that. Yes, we could do this. In that scenario where people are looking at all these options that the salesperson's put in front of them, what they realize is, especially when they can't really tell the difference between those different options and they all kind of look good. And so what their brains tell them is, you know what the safest thing to do is? Choose none of them. Sit on the sidelines and don't make a decision. The second fear of failure comes from information overload. And this is when our customer struggles with this fear that they haven't done enough research about our solution, about our competitors' solutions, about this space, this technology. I mean, think about it. They might buy a solution like ours once in their entire careers. There's no way they could possibly be the experts that we are as salespeople or as marketers, but they want to be. They want to try to be, because what they don't want to have happen after the purchase is made, when some new piece of information comes to light,
Of course.
and suddenly that purchase doesn't seem like the best idea. The third fear of messing up comes from expectations overload. Nobody wants to have their name associated with a purchase, especially right now, that doesn't pan out, right? And they cannot afford to look like a fool. They want to look like a hero, but they're worried that the vendor doesn't have their back. And you know what's so interesting about that one, Kyle, is that we found customers don't actually blame vendors at all. It's not that they accuse vendors of being nefarious or underhanded. They say, I totally get it, but you don't understand, Kyle. Our company screws this stuff every day of the week and twice on Sunday. There is no way we're ever going to get a 10x ROI. So those are the three big sort of fears of messing up. And one of the other things I'll say, and this comes up a lot of people say, well, no decision is a decision. And I think it is when you're choosing to stay with the status quo.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're indecisive, by definition, that is not a decision. That is the customer stuck in a state of decision limbo. And what we write about in the book is the playbook that high performers use to get them unstuck and get them moving forward.
All right, so let's talk about the playbook for overcoming this indecision. You've convinced us that indecision is the enemy here in many sales scenarios. So now we can jolt people out of this indecisiveness with these principles, this useful little acronym that you've created. So let's start with the J. How do you judge the indecision?
Yeah, so JOLT is an acronym. We like it because it's memorable, but it also speaks to what's happening. The one thing I'll say before I talk about the J, Kyle, is that I think it's really important for salespeople to remember the guidance here is not to stop doing what you're already doing. Remember, I mentioned before, like, oh my goodness, I'm worried that everything we said in Challenger was wrong. I think upon reflection and after digging into the data, it turns out the best salespeople in our study were really good at showing the customer the pain of same is worse than the pain of change. They're really good at doing the Challenger thing. They're really good at answering the why change question, but they do more than that. And I think that's what we realized here is that our understanding of sales was limited, and there's actually more to it. Now, if we think about how to judge the level of indecision, this is tricky because indecision's everywhere, but to salespeople can feel like it's nowhere. So if you look at deals and you bucket them from customers who are displaying low levels of indecision to moderate to high, what you find is that deals where there's actually a decisive manager or leader on the other end of the phone are actually the exception, not the rule. It's only 13% of deals where customers are unencumbered by fear of failure. If you find one of those people, you should sell them as much as humanly possible, as soon as humanly possible. But it turns out 87% of the deals we studied had customers displaying either moderate or high levels of indecision. But this is weird, and it's confounding for salespeople because those concerns we just talked about, customers don't talk about this stuff. You ask your customers if they think they're decisive, 10 out of 10 will raise their hand and say, absolutely, yes, I get paid to make the tough calls. But again, 87% of them are not. In that respect, they all suffer from the Dunning-Kruger effect. And the reason they don't talk about it with salespeople is that it's embarrassing. Like, nobody wants to talk about their concern that their boss might dislike them or their team might not respect them or they might get fired if this doesn't pan out. They want to come across as very decisive, especially to the salesperson, right? Now, how do we get customers willing to talk about this? The way we do it is we've got to create a safe zone to discuss it. One of the techniques we surfaced in the research is this technique called pings and echoes. And it's much like how a surface ship might detect a submarine below the water. Imagine that submarine as customer indecision. And you know it's out there. You know, it's not coming above the waterline, but you got to figure out if it's out there. So you would do what a surface ship would do, which is you would ping, send out a sound in the water, and you're listening for a reflection back. A ping in sales is quite literally when a high-performing salesperson tries to articulate the fear they think the customer's struggling with, but do it in a way that doesn't out the customer, but rather makes them feel like this is totally normal. You know, so it might be picking up a little bit that maybe you and the team aren't 100% sure what's nice to have and what's neat to have. And to be totally honest, that's probably my fault because we're so proud of what we do here. I've shown you so much, so many different use cases, so many different integrations, so many different roadmap items. I've probably added to this confusion. And I do want to let you know that every single customer who ends up buying our solution at some point in the process has that moment where they're, again, looking at the buffet and saying, I don't know where to start, you know, and I can't afford to make that decision in the wrong way. So I want to see if that's what's going on with you and the team. And if it is, I want to be of service to you and see if I can help you navigate through that. that might get you to say, yeah, like, yes, we are struggling with that. We cannot afford to have this go sideways on us. Or it might get you to say, no, it's not that at all. I'm sorry if we haven't been above board about what we like and what we don't like. I can tell you right now, we've written it down. My concern is more that ROI projection in the business case. I just don't think we're ever going to get that. And it's got to be believable or we'll get laughed out of the CFO's office. So that's really important because it tells us what is the source of the customer's indecision, what's the play for overcoming it, which it also tells us how to forecast that opportunity. It tells us whether in extreme cases, maybe we should disqualify that opportunity. Is this customer so mired in their own fear of failure, in indecision, that it's just going to take us an eternity to get them off the hump? And so maybe instead we should spend our time elsewhere, put them in a drip campaign, and redeploy our time against better, more decisive customers.
It's super interesting, Matt. And there's a lot of through lines to what we're now finding as the best practices for cold emailing, which is introducing what are called indecisive tones. Mm-hmm. For so many years, sellers have been taught about the power of surety and confidence and declarative statements and all of that. And really what we're finding in cold email, and certainly it sounds like what you've found in your studies, is that introducing that little bit of indecisiveness as the seller, saying, hey, look, I may not know the exact right formula for success for you, but here's what I think is going on. That is humanizing. And that's a powerful way, especially as you just said, to help you run the right play in the rest of the JOLT playbook. Once you get an answer from them, you send out that ping, you get the echo back, and now you can decide, how am I going to navigate this decision tree to make sure that I'm responding in an effective way?
You said something really important here, this humanizing element. As I mentioned before, everything we wrote about in Challenger, we say, keep doing that. And if you have a different approach for overcoming the status quo, you got to do that. That's the battle for beating customer indifference. But what we got to understand is when the customer stops worrying about whether to do this, what they start worrying about is how to do it. So you got to shift gears from trying to beat the status quo to trying to overcome indecision. That is all about instilling confidence, making our customer feel like, I trust you that you're guiding me to the right choices. I trust you that you're guiding me to the information I need to know and the stuff that I can ignore. And that is a humanizing kind of conversation. And I think you're right, that level of honesty around, maybe I don't have this right. And maybe my sense is maybe you're a little bit nervous about this. Let's talk about it, is a very human approach to sales. And I think in this age of ChatGPT, we're talking about, machines selling for us one day. This is if in many respects, a call for the human salesperson, right? Because I struggle to see how a machine could actually do some of the things we talk about here, which is really about putting your arm around the customer's shoulders and saying, it's going to be okay.
100%. As long as humans are buying, it's going to require humans to sell. Let's talk about, you send that ping, you get the echo back, and you realize that, hey, maybe they're not comfortable purchasing the whole enchilada right now. Maybe they're looking at the buffet or whatever it may be, and they want to stay away from the sushi, but maybe they want to go toward the steak. Talk to us about the O in JOLT, which is offering up recommendations.
First, say what most salespeople tend to do when it feels like the customer's struggling with what to choose. Salespeople tend to revert back to needs diagnosis. So, Kyle, why don't you tell me why you first reached out to us? Why don't you tell me what was most interesting to you in the demos or in the reference calls you did? Because what I don't want to do is say, oh, Kyle, I would, even if I know, I don't want to say I would choose this and have you say, well, I disagree, I want something else, right? And what I don't want to have happen is I steer you in one way and maybe it doesn't pan out and then you blame me. So I'd rather you make the decision. It was very similar to, I had an orthopedic issue and I was asking my doctor like what he recommended. And he said, well, you can medicate, you can do PT, or you can have surgery. And I was like, what would you recommend? He said, well, you can do one of these three things. I said, what if it was your joint? He literally wouldn't answer the question.
Stonewall.
Because I don't want to be on the hook for the wrong answer.
Right.
That's for different reasons of malpractice, et cetera. But we see that in sales as well. And if all we do is diagnose, basically we're putting the problem back on the customer's shoulders and it doesn't lead to very good outcomes. So we found best salespeople do is that they will proactively guide the customer to a narrower consideration set. So say, look, I put a lot in front of you. Let's put all of these things to the side and let's focus on these configurations, for instance. And if I were you, I would go in this direction, right? I think customers like you, and based on what I understand about your organization, this is where I think you're going to see the most value. So they advocate for a specific course of action, but they do it in a way where they harness the delegation effect. It's the same thing that happens, Kyle, when you or I go to a restaurant and we're struggling with what to choose.
Yep.
And the wait person says, if you want my opinion, this is my favorite dish. It's our most popular item. If you want something a bit lighter, here's another option. But the choice is really yours and you can't go wrong because everything we make here is great. What that does is a couple of things. One, it shifts the burden of a bad choice. Now that wait person is sharing in the bad choice. So if you don't like what they recommend, it's not all your fault because you went with their recommendation. That's a simple example, but it turns out it's true for $1 million B2B purchases as well. That delegation effect is very powerful. The customer wants you to share in that burden of choice or selection. And the other thing that happens is, again, by telling the customer, look, it is ultimately up to you, you're reinforcing their autonomy. This is something actually that Robert Cialdini wrote about just recently on LinkedIn, which he's found from some of his recent research, that you can guide the customer to a specific choice, but still reinforce that ultimately the choice is there. So it's okay if you disagree with me and you want to go in a different direction. That's fine too.
Very interesting. So being able to put yourself in their shoes,
Yep.
offer a recommendation that guides them down a prescriptive path that removes that burden of having to make the decision. And importantly here, Matt, it positions you as a true strategic advisor. And the way that I think about this kind of from a metaphorical standpoint is you're not sitting on opposite sides of the table discussing or debating what you're going to do. You slide over to the same side of the table with them, you're sharing the screen, and you're co-authoring the right path forward.
Somebody said to us during the research, and I think we mentioned this in the book, that best salespeople, when you hear them talk about these techniques, what you often hear them refer to is, I try to imagine if I were selling to a family member or selling to a really close friend of mine, what would your honest guidance be? And this comes up in the L, which I'll skip ahead a little bit, but L is about limiting the explorations, about dealing with this information overload problem. And I think this is really where what psychologists call the agency dilemma really comes to play. The agency dilemma refers to this problem of distrust that exists between the salesperson and the customer. And the distrust itself stems from information asymmetry. The salesperson knows a heck of a lot more about the solution. They know what works and what doesn't work. But because I've got the full picture, this is the customer's perception at least, I'm only feeding to you the good stuff. It is now incumbent upon the customer to do their own due diligence to figure out what is the salesperson hiding from me. And it sets the customer up for this never-ending analysis paralysis journey because there is no way they could become as much of an expert as that salesperson. But they're deathly afraid of having one put over on them, right? So what you found best salespeople do, the way they get the customer to stop trying to be an expert, and Kyle, I need you to trust me that I'm your expert here, you don't need to be an expert, is they take specific moments, usually early in the sale, to point out things like the customer shouldn't buy. So for instance, I put a lot in front of you. As much as I'd love to sell you this, I know, Kyle, you've been talking about the premium version of the solution. I actually got to be honest, the basic version is going to be just fine. I don't really know that you and your organization are at the level where you can take full advantage of the premium version capabilities. Those moments show the customer that your job is not to hide the dirty laundry and put one over on them and oversell them. Your job is to get them to a great decision. You're kind of agnostic because your sole purpose here is making sure your customer is getting to the right decision for them, for their team, and for their organization. And so I find this a lot in technology-based industries in particular. We've encouraged our salespeople to kind of show up with the clown car of experts on every single call. So the solutions engineers, the product people, the executive sponsors, and there's nothing wrong with that inherently. But what they often will do is punt the call to those experts. And they'll sit back and take notes and they'll be thinking, this is great because the customer's getting all this value from all these really smart people on my side who can go really deep on the product and use cases and capabilities. But something actually pretty bad happens to the salesperson in that moment, which is you get delegated down to the person you sound like. And if you're not adding any value, you're really just seen as a glorified admin by your customer.
That's right.
And you're setting up this dynamic where the customer might trust you, but they don't really know that you know a heck of a lot more about this than I do. What it means is that salespeople need to be really, really thoughtful about how they use their team members. Don't carpet bomb your customer with subject matter experts. Use it in more of a surgical way. Come in to answer specific questions, but make sure that the customer still sees you as the person guiding the journey. And it also means for salespeople, you need to develop your own plan to increase your own product expertise over time. But it does mean that when your subject matter experts are answering those really detailed questions, you should be listening and taking notes so that you can answer those questions next time, right? And make it a goal to be able to carry the baton farther down the field. And that is going to do wonders for your ability to tell the customer, you know what? You don't need a fifth reference call. You don't need to go talk to like everybody in your LinkedIn network. I know a heck of a lot more than you do about this, and I'm going to be able to guide you to the right decisions. And so it does position you as a trusted expert in those moments, and it gets the customer to stop trying to be an expert themselves and say, you know what? I don't need to be. I'm working with somebody who's got my back.
That's exactly right, Matt. It's really well said. And more tactically, this stuck with me when I was reading the book, is that the way that I think about it as a salesperson is really you're the choreographer. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to get the choreography right for this dance so that the right people float in and out in the right time. And so if I bring my CRO to a call and he's going to do an exact type thing, I don't want him leading the 45-minute demo. I am leading the 45-minute demo. I tag him in for 2 to 5 minutes, and then I dismiss him for the rest. And I do that every single time I'm engaging with any member of the clown car. And that's the way that you are maintaining control over the process and maintaining credibility with the person that you're selling to.
Over the years, the companies where I've worked, I've seen a big difference between average performing sellers who are, they think they're doing right for the customer, but it's a lot of like, hey, Kyle, take it away. Like, I brought Kyle on the phone. He's a CMO. He used to run sales. Like, he's an expert. Kyle, go. And I sit back and I'm like, man, and you go for the entire time because you want to help, right? But you find your best salespeople are going to do is they're going to say, Kyle, let's meet beforehand. Like you're saying, let's choreograph the call. Let's think about what specific things you're going to say, what I'm going to say, what the customer might respond with. And let's make sure that I'm carrying the baton. It's a more thoughtful, planful kind of approach that you find high performers use. It's not rocket science. I need to be seen as that choreographer and as an expert, right?
That's right. Collaboration for the sake of collaboration is not the way here.
Yeah.
You want to collaborate. You want to bring in the right subject matter experts. You need to do it with intent. We've gotten through the J, the O, and the L. We are on the T, probably the most controversial from a tactical standpoint, Matt, which is taking risk off the table.
So taking risk off the table deals with that expectations overload problem. Now, there's two things I would say. The first technique is managing expectations. It's the old principle of under promise and over deliver. And what you find is that there's a big difference between the expectations that high performers set with their customers versus average performers. Average performers are totally cool with the customer, like seeing that once in a lifetime proof point or case study on the website and being like, we want that. High performers will say like, absolutely, we stand by that, but I actually would prefer that we set you up for upside. I don't think we need to go in the CFO's office and promise a 20x ROI, but I'll tell you, we get 10x in 100% of our customer implementations. We're going to do better than that, but that's going to impress the CFO. Average performers don't want to do that because again, they're worried that if they start doing that, it comes across as weakness and, oh, maybe you don't really have confidence that we could get to those outcomes. High performers have no qualms about doing it. So that's the first thing, because if you set improper expectations, that's when customers really start to get angst later. Now, the second piece is about de-risking. How do we create a safety net for our customers? Now, the easy stuff, I would say the freebie stuff, the stuff that deals with kind of perceived outcome uncertainty, perceived risk. So for instance, pulling forward customer success and having a conversation about the plan to go from signature to value. Here are the owners, the checkpoints, the KPIs, et cetera, and instilling that confidence with the customer that you guys have done this before. That's a freebie, right? We should be doing that with everybody. Another freebie is an executive sponsor. So being able to say to the customer, for you as a strategic customer, a big enterprise logo, our CEO is looking at this deal and she is going to be personally invested in the success here. So I'm going to share with you her email and cell phone number. I want you to know that she has asked me to convey that to you, that if anything goes wrong, that she wants you to go directly to her and she's going to make sure that you experience tremendous value from this purchase. Chances the customer does that are close to zero, but it is a big confidence giver for customers. So then we start to veer into the stuff that actually does cost the customer money. So here's an example, layering on professional services support. So I know a lot of solution providers out there pride themselves on the fact that the customer can DIY it, right? High performers, it turns out, would often encourage the customer to add professional services. They didn't give it away for free, but they would say, Kyle, I know you guys want to DIY this and I stand by that claim. That being said, I know you guys are spending a lot of money on this and I know budgets are really tight. And I think it would be wise to carve out a small slug of professional services hours that in case this goes sideways, we've got the A-team lined up. They come in, swarm the problem, get you back on track. That's a small one. A bigger one is actually encouraging the customer to start smaller. I know you want the enterprise-wide $1 million solution with all the integration and so on and so forth. I actually think we should start with the $100,000 use case specific. Let's get some experience working together and expand from there. Average performers love when the customer talks themselves into a bigger price point. High performers know that is a deal that is going to take an eternity to get over the line. If it does come over the line, that is a deal that the customer is feeling agita about immediately. So better to start small, instill the confidence and expand from there. Just puts a lot less pressure on your customer. Opt-out clauses are another one. But those companies who can create contract carve-outs, for instance, are there parts of the agreement that the customer is feeling anxious about? Maybe it's one specific business unit. Maybe for that business unit, we give them a no questions asked opt-out clause in case they are feeling a lot of risk and it's going to keep the deal from moving forward. It gives the customer the confidence they need to move forward. And then we know what we're up against. We got to absolutely swarm all the problems in that one business unit or that one use case. to make sure the customer re-ups it or trues it up with the rest of the agreement. And I think some of the debate this creates is a lot of times you'll hear people saying, well, that's just like lazy selling. I think that's a wrong way to think about it because it's not about your inability to sell the customer or convince them. Remember, we're trying to win the battle for indecision, which is fundamentally about fear of failure. And no amount of hammering the customer on the value, no amount of hammering them on the FUD is going to get them more comfortable with it. So we've got to do something to show them we have got your back. You are going to look like a hero, not like a fool when you put your name on this agreement.
When I was reading the book, and as you were talking through that, Matt, I was reminded of a seminal book on negotiation by Stuart Diamond called Getting More. Diamond says what the best negotiators do is they find ways to trade things of unequal value.
Absolutely.
And that's exactly what you're talking about. So finding those things that really matter to them that are relatively low value to you is key to making this happen.
I love that insight, Colin. I think that's a great resource, and I'd encourage all sellers to read that book. And I think there's a really important lesson in there around de-risking as well, which is de-risk according to plan. Come in with the expectation that your customer is going to ask for you to shoulder some of the risk. Come in with a list even of here's the really easy stuff to give away, all the way to the things that are actually going to cost real money. Don't start with those things because often they're not necessary. You can get the customer a lot of the way there with some of the free stuff, which frankly is just good selling hygiene. We should be doing it with all our customers anyway.
So we've stepped through the entire JOLT framework. There is way more detail in the book. There's way more tactical advice in the book. What I love so much about the book too, Matt, is that because you were studying the natural language of the sellers and you were reviewing all these calls, you have phrasing that you've suggested that people can use. So I can't recommend this book highly enough. Any parting thoughts about the book that you want?
So there's a lot of stuff, right? We spent a lot of time talking about the playbook around what drives, like we now know why do customers become indecisive, what leads to no decision losses. We also understand what's the playbook for overcoming it. What I've been struck by is the number of salespeople who come back to me after they read the book. They say, I'm now going back and I'm looking at some of my won deals and why I won and some of my lost deals and why I've lost. And now I'm thinking about some of the deals in pipeline right now. And I'm also looking at some of those deals where the customers ghosted me or gone radio silent. And suddenly I see this everywhere. And so the piece of guidance I would give salespeople is it's always a status quo problem. Just dial up the value, just dial up the FUD, hammer the status quo. You have a high probability if you do that of actually making things worse. The best thing you can do as a salesperson is hit the pause button and don't assume you know what's causing the customer to have cold feet, but dig a little bit deeper. And you often will find that there's more to it than just the customer not wanting to change or a preference for their status quo. But more often than not, that is not the problem. And you're doing yourself a disservice by treating every hesitant customer like a nail and you've got one hammer and you're just pounding away at them.
Unbelievably valuable here, Matt. The enemy of indecision. I have a bonus question. Has to do with a book recommendation that you would give to sellers. Anything that you feel like would be really valuable for a seller to get their hands on?
I would say we've tried in this book to take a page out of the books of Dan Pink and Gladwell and Ori Brofman and the Heath brothers, and the list goes on and on. 2 recommendations. One is from that category, which is Dan and Chip Heath's Made to Stick. There's so much of JOLT, Challenger Customer, that comes down to storytelling and making ideas really stick with people, which I think is even more important in this world of Zoom that we're all living in, where things start to wash together and bleed together and we struggle because we're not sitting in the customer's office and we don't remember those experiences of like the rental car breaking down and that kind of stuff. It's just called sameness, right? And so making those really kind of memorable moments is something that's really important for us. I think Made to Stick is like the Bible for why certain ideas stick and stay with people and others get forgotten. And I think for salespeople, that's super important to understand. It's absolutely critical, of course, for marketers as well when it comes to creating memorable content that breaks through the noise and stays with our customer and gets them to want to act and move forward and talk to us. The other one is Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. And we talk a lot about Kahneman and Tversky and their seminal work around prospect theory and loss aversion, status quo bias versus omission bias.
Awesome stuff, Matt. This has been absolutely fantastic. Where can people go to learn more about you, to learn more about the book?
So reach out to me on LinkedIn. Then you can check out jolteffect.com. We've got a lot more about the research, some free tools and resources for people to download. Then there's a lot of information about how to do training on this. There's actually a self-paced learning journey you can go through as an individual seller or as a team leader or as a CRO. Lots of resources available on that site.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Matt. Have a lovely rest of your day.
Thanks for having me.
Don't let what you heard today go to waste. Take 2 minutes to download today's checklist to get your priorities in line for the week. You can find that linked in our show notes. And if you liked what you heard, Make sure you give us a 5-star rating and leave a review. We'll be back next Monday with more to help you win your week.